The rain was relentless as it battered against the dark windows of the house on 25 Cromwell Street. The old, decaying building loomed like a spectre against the stormy backdrop of Gloucester, its facade cracked and forgotten by time. To most, it was just another abandoned house, but to those who knew the Wests, it was the home of something far darker. Fred West, a burly man with an unsettling calmness, stood by the window, his eyes scanning the street below. He looked out of place, like a predator patiently waiting in the shadows, and in many ways, he was. Inside, the house held a darkness that few could ever comprehend. Its walls whispered secrets of the horrors that had occurred within. Rosemary West, his wife, moved silently behind him, her long dark hair cascading like a cloak of night. There was a coldness to her gaze, an emptiness that betrayed the mask of warmth she tried to wear in front of others. She had the look of a woman who had long abandoned the notion of morality. She wasn't just complicit in the horrors of Cromwell Street, she was an active participant. The Wests had carefully constructed a facade of normalcy, raising children, keeping up appearances. But behind closed doors, they were monsters, hungry, insatiable, and ruthless. The basement of 25 Cromwell Street was a place of terror, a place where victims would vanish, never to be heard from again. The walls could no longer hold their screams, and the floors had absorbed their blood. It all started with a simple question. Would you like to come in for a drink? Fred had asked his first victim, a young woman hitchhiking through the English countryside. She had been naive, trusting, a victim of circumstance. She had no idea what awaited her on the other side of the door. Fred, in his sickeningly smooth voice, led her to the basement. She thought it was just another quiet evening with a stranger. She couldn't have been more wrong. The basement was damp, the air thick with the smell of mildew and something more sinister. The girl, too frightened to move, was forced to kneel, her hands bound behind her. Fred's cold hands guided her, as if he were leading her toward something inevitable, something unspoken. Rosemary stood by, watching, waiting. She had no mercy in her eyes. She knew exactly what was about to happen, and she wanted to be part of it. Together, they were an unstoppable, forcer, deadly, calculating team. While Fred brutalized the girl, Rosemary prepared the tools, ready to help dispose of the body when the deed was done. But that was just the beginning. The West's home was no ordinary home. It was a place where nightmares were born, where innocent lives were snuffed out with cold precision. The house was a graveyard of memories, each room holding the echoes of the lives taken within its walls. As the days passed, more victims came and went, their faces fading into the shadowy corners of the house. Women, girls, even young boys, none were safe from the clutches of the Wests. No one could hear their screams in the night, not when the house was so isolated, so hidden from the prying eyes of the world. But the Wests weren't invincible. It would only be a matter of time before someone would discover what lurked behind their doors. The truth, like the bloodstains on the floor, would eventually be revealed. The rain had stopped, but the storm still raged inside Fred and Rosemary West. The house at 25 Cromwell Street stood like a sentinel in the dark, its walls shrouded in secrets, its corridors echoing with the memories of the lives lost within. Inside, Fred sat in the dimly lit living room, his broad shoulders hunched, hands steepled in front of his face as if in deep thought. Rosemary moved around him, a silent presence. She was always close to close, her gaze never leaving his, as if watching for any sign of weakness. But there was no weakness in Fred West. There never had been. Their relationship had always been one of twisted necessity. Rosemary had been just as broken as Fred, if not more so. She had her own demons that were far older than her union with Fred. But together, they had forged a bond built on manipulation, violence, and the darkest desires. It was a bond that would prove to be their undoing. Fred's eyes, cold and calculating, narrowed as he glanced toward the staircase. The house was too quiet. He could hear the creak of the floorboards above as one of their children walked past. The Wests had 4 children, each of them raised in the shadows of terror. They were oblivious to the horrors that took place under their roof, or at least, that's what Fred and Rosemary believed. But things were beginning to unravel. The house that had once been a fortress of silence was beginning to feel claustrophobic. The walls were starting to close in. The walls that had witnessed their gruesome crimes now were whispering, as if they could no longer hold their secrets. Rosemary stood still, listening, her breath shallow, her lips parted in anticipation. The silence was always the hardest part. It was in the silence that the weight of their actions bore down on them. It was in the silence that they could hear the ghosts of their past victims, each one a voice, pleading for justice that would never come. Fred stood abruptly, breaking the silence. His hands were trembling slightly, a rare moment of vulnerability that Rosemary didn't miss. "We need to do something," he muttered, his voice low and urgent. "We can't keep living like this." Rosemary's eyes darkened as she moved toward him. She placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch cold, like the icy fingers of death itself. "What do you mean?" she asked softly, but there was a dangerous edge in her voice. Fred turned to face her. "It's getting too risky. People are starting to notice. We can't afford any more mistakes." For a moment, there was silence between them. Then Rosemary smiled, a twisted grin that sent a chill down Fred's spine. "We've always known how to handle problems, haven't we?" Fred's lips curled into a tight smile. He knew what she meant. They had always been able to silence anyone who dared to stand in their way. But now, things were different. The walls were starting to echo with more than just their secrets. They were echoing with fear. The first victim had been a young woman named Mary, a hitchhiker who had trusted Fred when he offered her a ride. She had no idea what was coming, but after that night, Mary was just another body, just another name to be buried in the darkness of Cromwell Street. Fred had buried her in the garden, a spot where no one would think to look. The Wests had a way of hiding things, of covering their tracks, of making sure that their deeds were as invisible as the shadows that crept through the house. But as the years passed, their killings became more brazen, more frequent. They no longer feared being caught. They were invincible, or so they thought. Rosemary's eyes flickered with cold determination. "We don't need to worry about the past. We need to think about the future." Fred nodded, his mind already turning. "And what about the others?" he asked, referring to their children. Rosemary's smile grew wider. "They'll be fine. They'll grow up just like we did. They'll learn what they need to survive." Fred looked toward the stairs again, his eyes narrowing. He wasn't so sure. There was something about their youngest daughter, Heather, that unnerved him. She was far too observant, far too aware for her age. She often asked questions that Fred and Rosemary could never answer. Fred's thoughts were interrupted by a loud knock at the door. It was sudden and unexpected. Fred's heart skipped a beat. Who could it be? He motioned for Rosemary to stay silent, and together they crept toward the front door. Fred peered through the peephole. A man stood on the doorstep, dressed in a dark coat, his face hidden beneath the brim of his hat. Fred's pulse quickened. Something was wrong. With a swift motion, he unlocked the door, but before he could open it fully, the man pushed his way inside, forcing Fred back. The man's eyes were cold, calculating, and he spoke in a low, gravelly voice. "I'm here for the girl," he said, glancing around the darkened room. Fred froze. What girl? The man's gaze shifted to the staircase, and Fred knew instantly that his worst fear had come to life. Someone was looking for the missing girls. Someone was beginning to ask the questions they had worked so hard to avoid. Fred's hand tightened around the door handle. He could hear Rosemary's breath behind him, steady and cold. It was the beginning of the end. The house that had once been their kingdom was now a trap one that was slowly closing in around them. Fred's mind raced. Every instinct screamed at him to act, but he stood frozen, weighing his options, calculating. The man who stood before him, so calm, so composed, was not here by accident. His words, "I'm here for the girl," had shattered the fragile illusion Fred and Rosemary had worked so hard to create. Rosemary slipped silently into the hallway behind Fred, her hands trembling, though she would never allow fear to show on her face. She understood, just as Fred did, that one wrong move could tear everything apart. Fred forced a smile, the corners of his mouth twitching with the effort. "I think you're mistaken, mate," he said, his voice low and almost casual. "Ain't no girl here, but our kids aren't. They're not the ones you're looking for." The visitor stepped further into the house without invitation. His boots thudded dully against the worn floorboards. His eyes, sharp as knives, scanned the dim interior, the cramped hallways. The stale air heavy with secrets, the faint stench of rot that no amount of cleaning could ever fully erase. "I know about Mary," he said simply. Fred stiffened. "I know about Lucy and Charmaine and the others too," the man continued, his voice devoid of emotion. "I know what's buried here." Rosemary clutched the wall to steady herself. No one had ever dared to say their names out loud. No one had ever looked them in the eyes and called them murderers. Fred's fingers twitched at his side. His mind conjured images of the basement, the cold, damp room with the iron restraints bolted to the floor. The tools of terror they had carefully hidden away. If this man knew even a fraction of the truth, then everything was at risk. Fred licked his lips, his mouth suddenly dry. "I don't know who you are," he said, voice growing rough, "but you've got the wrong house." The man smiled, and the expression was colder than any winter night. "I don't think so," he whispered. At that moment, the light bulb above them flickered, casting long, dancing shadows across the hallway. Fred's heart pounded in his chest. He had to act. If he let this man leave alive, it would all be over. Without warning, Fred lunged. The hallway exploded into chaos. Fred's heavy frame slamming into the man, fists flying. Rosemary shrieked, a sound more beast than human, and joined the fray, her nails clawing at the intruder's face. The man fought back, striking Fred hard across the jaw. Fred staggered but didn't fall. He grabbed the man by the throat, slamming him against the wall so hard the plaster cracked. The struggle was brutal, primal. Fred, fueled by years of hidden violence, overpowered him. In a desperate frenzy, Rosemary found the heavy iron poker from beside the fireplace and brought it down with a sickening crack against the man's skull. He collapsed to the floor, blood pooling beneath his head. Breathing heavily, Fred looked down at the motionless body. His fists were bloodied, his shirt torn. Rosemary stood beside him, the poker still clutched in her hands, her chest heaving. "We have to move him," Fred growled. "But what if someone saw?" Rosemary's voice was a broken whisper. "No one saw," Fred snapped. "We'll take him down to the basement." Together, they dragged the lifeless form down the creaking stairs. The basement swallowed them whole, as if eager for a new offering. The air grew colder with every step, thick with the scent of earth and decay. At the bottom, Fred kicked open the hidden trapdoor that led to the shallow graves beneath the foundation, the place where countless victims now rested, unnamed and unmourned. Fred and Rosemary worked quickly, stripping the man of anything that could identify him. They buried him hastily, shoveling dirt onto his bloodied face until he was just another forgotten soul beneath the house of horrors. When they finished, they stood in the dark, panting, but something was wrong. Fred wiped the sweat from his forehead and looked at Rosemary. Her face was pale, her eyes wide. "What?" he hissed. She pointed to the wall, the crumbling concrete wall that separated the basement from the outside world. Etched into the dirt with a finger were words. "They know." Fred stumbled backward. Had the man written it while he lay dying? Or had it been there before? The basement seemed to close in around them. Every whisper of the wind through the cracks sounded like voices. Every creak of the house sounded like footsteps coming closer. The ground beneath their feet felt unstable, ready to give way and pull them into the earth with their victims. For the first time, Fred West felt fear, not the fear of being caught, but the fear of something much older, something colder, something coming for them. The house was different now. Fred felt it in his bones. The moment he stepped through the door, after burying the intruder, the air shifted thicker, heavier, as if the house itself had inhaled something foul and was now exhaling rot into every room. Rosemary tried to keep busy, scrubbing the blood from the floors, washing the walls, rearranging the furniture. But no amount of cleaning could erase what they had done, nor what they had unleashed. At night, Fred lay awake, staring at the cracked ceiling. The shadows above twisted and coiled into strange, writhing shapes. He told himself it was the flicker of the street lamp outside, the dance of light and dark. But deep down, Fred knew better. Sometimes, when the house settled with a low groan, he heard the scraping of nails on the walls, the shuffling of feet across the floorboards, the soft, wet sound of breathing coming from the basement stairs. At first, he blamed the children. Maybe Heather had gotten up to use the bathroom. But when he rose to check, the hallway was empty, silent. The doors to the children's rooms were closed, undisturbed. It was something else. One night, Fred woke to find the basement door open. It swung gently on its hinges, the blackness beyond so complete that it seemed to swallow the light. Cold air rushed up the stairs, carrying with it a smell Fred knew too well: earth, blood, and something older, something that didn't belong to this world. He stumbled out of bed, heart pounding, and moved toward the stairs. A voice floated up from the darkness. "Fred." It was faint, almost a whisper, a woman's voice, soft, broken. A voice he had heard before. "Mary." Fred staggered back, slamming the door shut. He bolted it and pushed a heavy dresser in front of it for good measure. Sweat dripped from his forehead. His hands trembled. He tried to tell Rosemary, but she laughed it off, chalking it up to guilt or stress. She wasn't hearing the voices, not yet. But that was about to change. The next day, Rosemary was alone in the kitchen when she heard the knock. 3 sharp raps against the back door. She froze, heart leaping into her throat. No one ever came to the back door. Slowly, she approached, pressed her ear against the wood. Nothing. She shook her head, berating herself, and turned back toward the stove. Bung, bung. This time louder, more insistent. The door rattled on its hinges. Rosemary's blood ran cold. She inched back toward the door and flung it open. No one was there. Only the empty backyard, soaked in mist and rain. The dying garden, the sagging fence. The lone tree that scratched the sky with its skeletal branches. And then she looked down. Footprints. Small, bare footprints, leading from the woods to the door and back again. Rosemary slammed the door, locked it, and stumbled backward, clutching her chest. Something was hunting them. Fred decided they needed to clean up once and for all. He led Rosemary into the basement that night, armed with shovels, flashlights, and rope. They would dig up the bodies, move them, destroy all evidence of their sins. But when they reached the bottom of the stairs, they found the ground disturbed, as if something had been digging from the inside. Graves split open, coffins broken, dirt piled high against the crumbling walls, and worst of all, the bodies were missing. Fred swung his flashlight frantically, its beams slicing through the darkness. Nothing. Only the faint trail of mud leading up the stairs. "Christ," Fred muttered, his voice barely a breath, and then a hand shot out from the earth, grabbing his ankle. Fred screamed and fell backward, flashlight clattering to the ground. The beam caught a glimpse of the thing dragging itself from the soil, a figure, twisted and broken, skin peeling from its face, eyes like two black voids. It was Mary, or what was left of her. More hands erupted from the dirt. More figures. Heather, Lucy, Charmaine. Their mouths agape in silent, endless screams. Fred scrambled to his feet, yanking Rosemary upward. They fled the basement, slamming the door behind them, bolting it shut. But they could still hear it. The scraping, the scratching, the relentless pounding. The dead had awakened, and they were not going to rest until they pulled the Wests down into the darkness with them. The house groaned and shifted under the weight of its own evil. Pictures fell from the walls. Doors slammed shut without warning. Windows shattered from within. Fred sat at the kitchen table, head in his hands, his mind unraveling. "They're coming for us," he whispered. Rosemary, usually so strong, so unshakable, now wept openly, her hands trembling as she clutched the crucifix she had torn from their bedroom wall. There was no escape, no salvation, only the slow, inevitable descent into the very hell they had created. In the final moments before dawn, Fred heard them again. Voices, footsteps. This time, from inside the house, from the stairs, and then he saw them, standing at the top of the basement steps, staring down at him with hollow, accusing eyes. The dead had come home, and they were waiting. The house was no longer a home, it was a tomb. Fred and Rosemary huddled together in the kitchen, the faint glow of the single overhead bulb casting sickly shadows across the walls. Every door in the house was bolted shut, every window nailed down, yet the cold found them, seeping through cracks, curling around their ankles like the fingers of the dead. Outside, the night pressed heavy against Cromwell Street. The mist was so thick it looked like the ground itself was breathing. Somewhere beyond the fog, sirens wailed faintly too far away to save them. They were alone. Fred hadn't slept in days. His face had hollowed, his cheeks sunken, his eyes bloodshot and wild. Rosemary had become little more than a shadow herself, pacing the house in circles, muttering under her breath, dragging her nails across the walls until they bled. In the darkest corner of the room, Fred saw them, the shapes, first just flickers at the edge of his vision, then clearer, sharper faces he recognized all too well. Victims he had buried and forgotten. Victims he had mocked in life and discarded in death. Now they stared back at him, Heather, Charmaine, Lucy, and Always Mary, with her ruined face and accusing eyes. They lined the kitchen, standing silent and still, waiting. Fred clutched Rosemary's hand. Her skin was cold as ice. "They're here," he whispered. Rosemary didn't respond. She was staring past him, her mouth open in a silent scream. Fred turned slowly. The door to the basement, the one they had barricaded so thoroughly, was swinging open. From the blackness beyond, a sound slithered out. A wet, dragging noise. Footsteps, and something worse. Breathing, thick and gurgling, like lungs filled with mud. Fred backed away, dragging Rosemary with him. But no matter how fast they moved, the darkness moved faster. It swallowed the kitchen, crept up the stairs, slithered through the halls. The house belonged to the dead now. They fled to the upper floors, past the bedrooms, past the memories, up into the attic. The final refuge. The attic was cramped and cold, filled with dusty boxes and forgotten relics of their children's childhood's broken toys, old dolls, faded photographs. Fred shoved the last piece of furniture against the trapdoor and collapsed against the far wall. Rosemary curled up beside him, rocking herself back and forth. For a moment, there was silence, only the sound of their own ragged breathing, and then tap, 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 the sound of fingernails scratching against wood from beneath the trapdoor. Fred grabbed a rusted pipe from the pile of junk and raised it high, ready to strike at anything that came through. But it wasn't the dead who came. It was Heather's voice, soft, childlike. "Daddy, why did you hurt me?" Fred froze. Heather had been the one he feared most, the one who had started asking questions, seeing too much. When she had disappeared, Fred had lied, told everyone she'd run away, buried her in the backyard like all the others. And now her voice filled the attic, pressing against his ears, against his mind. "Daddy, you said you loved me." The trapdoor shook violently. Dust rained from the rafters. Fred screamed and swung the pipe downward with all his strength. The wood splintered, cracking under the blow. Something black and writhing seeped through the cracks thick as tar, alive with movement. Fred backed away, tripping over old boxes. He saw them rising from the blackness, dozens of them faces, peeling, bones exposed, fingers reaching. Heather stood at the front, smiling, but it wasn't a child's smile. It was something worse. "Come with us, Daddy," she whispered. Fred turned to run, but Rosemary wasn't beside him anymore. She was standing in the middle of the attic, arms outstretched, eyes glassy and unblinking. Rosemary had already surrendered. The blackness swallowed her whole, pulling her down into the trapdoor. Her scream was short, choked off in an instant. Fred ran. He clawed at the boarded-up window, tearing the wood away with bloodied hands. Outside, the mist churned like a living thing. Shapes moved within it, dozens, maybe hundreds, all watching. He smashed the glass with his bare fists and hauled himself onto the slanted roof. Rain slicked the tiles, making every step treacherous. He slipped, catching himself on a rusted gutter. The mist swirled up around him, thick and choking. From below, the figures gathered silent, patient. Fred scrambled higher, heart pounding. He could see the city lights in the distance, life, escape, salvation. But they might as well have been a million miles away. The voices followed him onto the roof. "You can't run. You can't hide. You belong to us." Fred reached the peak of the roof and turned back. The attic window gaped open like a mouth. From it, the dead poured out, crawling, staggering, dragging themselves across the rain-slicked tiles. And in front of them all, Heather, smiling, waiting. Fred screamed a raw, primal sound and lost his footing. For a moment, he was weightless, then falling. The ground rushed up to meet him, and everything went black. Fred awoke in the mud. Rain pelted his broken body. Pain exploded through him with every breath. He tried to move, but couldn't. Above him, the figures loomed. Mary, Lucy, Charmaine, Heather, all of them, their faces closed now, so close he could see the worms writhing in their empty sockets. Heather knelt beside him, her broken fingers brushing his cheek. "You're home now, Daddy," she whispered. Fred tried to scream, but no sound came. The dead closed in. The earth opened beneath him. And Fred West was finally swallowed by the house he had built, a house of death, of secrets, of shadows. He would never leave. Not now, not ever. The rain did not stop for days after Fred West's death. It battered the windows of 25 Cromwell Street, turning the small backyard into a field of mud and rot. The gutters overflowed with dirty water. The mist hung low, refusing to lift, as if the house itself was trying to keep its secrets buried just a little longer. But secrets have a way of clawing their way to the surface. It was Heather's disappearance that finally broke the facade. For years, Fred and Rosemary had lied to their children, to their neighbors, to anyone who asked. She ran away, they said. Teenagers do that, but Fred's fall had changed things. Authorities began asking questions, real questions, questions that had no easy answers. When the police knocked on the door of 25 Cromwell Street, Rosemary answered, a hollow shell of the woman she once was. Her eyes were wild, darting to the shadows behind the officers, as if expecting the dead to come spilling out. The officers smelled the rot immediately. They didn't need a warrant. The stench of decay was probable cause enough. The search began, innocently enough, peeling back carpets, tapping on hollow walls, peering into dusty corners. But then, one Officer Detective Havers found the door to the basement. It was bolted. Heavy chains crisscrossed the frame. A desperate, obvious attempt to seal something away. The officers exchanged glances. They cut the chains. The door swung open with a groan that seemed almost human, and the smell hit them like a physical force, thick, gagging, undeniable. They descended into the dark, flashlights cutting through the gloom. What they found made seasoned men weep. The basement was a charnel house. Bones littered the dirt floor, some still wrapped in scraps of rotted clothing. Rusting chains hung from the walls. In the far corner, freshly disturbed earth hinted at graves not yet filled. Detective Havers knelt, brushing dirt away with shaking hands. A small skull emerged. Child-sized, he dropped the flashlight and staggered back. The news spread quickly. 25 Cromwell Street became a beacon of horror, drawing crowds of journalists, gawkers, and grieving families desperate for answers. Every day, police dug deeper. Every day, they unearthed another nightmare. Bodies stacked atop bodies. Victims that spanned years, young girls, women, even children. Their faces were gone, but their screams seemed to echo from the very walls. And at night, when the officers packed up and left the crime scene secured, strange things began to happen. The house came alive. Detective Havers was the first to notice it. One night, after a long day of cataloguing remains, he stayed late to finish paperwork. Alone in the dim kitchen, he heard footsteps upstairs, heavy, dragging footsteps. He called out, no answer. Thinking it was another officer, he climbed the stairs. The house was dark and silent. At the end of the hallway, the door to the children's old bedroom stood ajar. Inside, the faint glow of a nightlight flickered. He stepped closer. Through the crack in the door, he saw her, a little girl, sitting cross-legged on the floor, her back to him. She was humming a lullaby, off-key, broken. Something primal clawed at his gut, warning him to run. But he stepped inside anyway. "Hello," he said, voice shaking. "Are you hurt?" The girl turned. Half her face was missing. Maggots wriggled in the gaping wound where her cheek had been. She smiled. The door slammed shut behind him. Detective Havers stumbled backward, fumbling for the handle. But when he looked again, the girl was gone. Only the faint echo of her lullaby remained, floating through the rotting house. He fled, gasping for air, swearing never to return. But the others weren't so lucky. More officers reported strange occurrences. Whispers in the basement. Shadowy figures darting through the halls. Cold hands brushing against them in the dark. Some refused to enter the house altogether. Others fell illviately sick with fevers, hallucinations, uncontrollable terror. It was as if the house was fighting back, defending its secrets. Outside, the crowd grew restless. Some prayed, some wept, some cursed the ground itself. Candles and flowers piled up on the sidewalk, a shrine to the forgotten dead. But nothing could cleanse the evil that had seeped into the bones of Cromwell Street. The Wests had built a kingdom of suffering, and now the kingdom demanded tribute. At the center of it all, Rosemary sat in a tiny cell at the police station, rocking back and forth, muttering, singing lullabies to children who no longer lived. She spoke to the walls, to the shadows, to Fred, who was long gone but whose presence she still felt, heavy and accusing. When detectives questioned her, she smiled sweetly and said nothing. But sometimes, late at night, when the station grew quiet, Rosemary would begin to talk. To no one, or perhaps to someone only she could see. She spoke of bones in the walls, of the basement's hunger, of hands reaching up from the earth to drag sinners down. And she laughed. She laughed until she screamed. Back at 25 Cromwell Street, the final excavation uncovered the oldest, deepest graves. At the very foundation of the house, they found it. A pit lined with bones, deeper than any grave ought to be. Some said it had been there before the Wests moved in. A wound in the earth, a mouth that demanded blood, and Fred and Rosemary had simply fed it, again and again, until it could no longer be sated. The house was condemned, boarded up, left to rot, but the neighborhood never forgot. Children dared each other to touch the front steps. Stray animals avoided it. Lights flickered whenever anyone walked too close. And at night, if you stood very still, you could hear it. The faint, sorrowful singing of children lost in the dark, calling for help that would never come. The house at 25 Cromwell Street sat empty, its windows boarded shut, its doors chained and locked. Its very walls seemed to sag under the weight of the horror they had absorbed. But locking a door doesn't keep out the dead, and the dead were restless. Detective Havers tried to forget. After all, the investigation was over, the bodies counted, the crimes exposed. Fred was dead, Rosemary was rotting in prison. The case was closed, but the case would not leave him. Late at night, in the silence of his small flat, he heard them, footsteps in the hallway, knocking at the bedroom door, whispers in the walls. Help us, you saw us, you left us. He tried to drown them out with whiskey, with pills, with anything that would dull the gnawing terror eating away at him, but nothing worked. One night, he awoke to find muddy footprints leading from his front door to his bed. Small footprints, child-sized. He fled his home that night, leaving everything behind. He wasn't the only one. Other officers, other forensic workers who had spent time in the West House began to report the same thing. Nightmares that bled into waking life. Visions of rotting children lurking just beyond the reach of light. Voices calling them back to the house. One officer, a tough, no-nonsense sergeant named Miller, put a bullet through his own brain after 2 weeks of it. The note he left behind was simple. They're waiting for me in the walls. The town itself seemed poisoned. Crime rates spiked. Domestic violence soared. People moved away, abandoning their homes with furniture still inside, as if fleeing a fire only they could see. Cromwell Street became a wound no one could heal. In her prison cell, Rosemary West thrived. Or so it seemed. She smiled during her trial, laughed during sentencing. Even as jurors wept at the details of her crimes, Rosemary sat impassive, detached. But when the lights went out at night, the facade cracked. Guards heard her screaming in the dark. Screams so blood-curdling that seasoned prison staff refused to patrol her block after midnight. She spoke to things no one else could see, begged for mercy from children long dead, clawed at the walls of her cell until her nails ripped free from her fingers. She aged, rapidly, skin sagging, hair turning brittle and white, eyes sunken deep into her skull. It was as if something inside her was devouring her soul piece by piece, and still she survived, because the dead weren't finished with her yet. Back at Cromwell Street, the house waited, empty, hungry. It called to those foolish enough to listen. A group of urban explorers decided to break into the West House one cold October night. They laughed as they pried the boards from the windows, joked about ghosts and curses. They filmed everything, hoping to post it online and chase clout. The footage would later be found abandoned at the scene. The police never released the video publicly, but those who had seen it whispered stories. How the explorers laughed at first, posing in the filthy kitchen, mocking the haunted house. How the laughter faded when they reached the basement door. How the door swung open on its own. How the camera captured something moving in the darkness beyond the light. Something not quite human. And how, one by one, the explorers disappeared into the black, their screams cut off mid-breath. The final shot was of the camera dropping to the dirt, floor still filming. And then, a small hand reaching out of the darkness to grab it. The police found no bodies, only bloodstains, and tiny, muddy footprints crisscrossing the basement. The council finally ordered the demolition of 25 Cromwell Street. Bulldozers arrived, men in heavy machinery. The workers were nervous, crossing themselves, muttering prayers. The first strike of the wrecking ball hit the front wall. The ground shuddered. The mist rolled in thick and fast. And from the broken walls came a sound none of them would ever forget. Children screaming, screaming in rage, screaming in pain, screaming for vengeance. The machinery froze, engines stalled. The workers fled. No one would finish the job. The house refused to die. In the end, they paved it over, turned the lot into an empty square. No plaque, no memorial, just blank concrete, as if forgetting would erase what happened. But it didn't. People still avoid that place. Animals refuse to cross it. And sometimes, late at night, the mist returns. It pulls over the blank square, swirling, shifting. And if you listen carefully, you can still hear them. The lost, the forgotten, the furious. Detective Havers, older and broken, visited the square one last time before leaving the town forever. He stood in the mist, feeling it curl around his ankles like cold fingers. He whispered a prayer not for forgiveness, because he knew there would be none, but for peace, for them, for himself. From the mist, a voice answered, "Thank you." And for the first time in years, Havers wept. But as he turned to leave, he saw them. Dozens of shadowy figures standing just beyond the mist, watching, waiting. He knew, in his heart, he would never truly leave Cromwell Street. None of them ever would. Years passed. The world moved on. New crimes filled the headlines. New monsters were born. The Wests faded into the fog of history, reduced to a cautionary tale, a whispered legend. 25 Cromwell Street became nothing but a slab of concrete, cold and featureless, like a scar trying to hide itself beneath the skin. But evil doesn't die. It sleeps, and one day it wakes. In 2032, the council approved a project to build a playground over the lot. New beginnings for Gloucester, the mayor said. A place of laughter where there was once only sorrow. Construction began in early spring. Workers dug into the soil, laying the foundations for swings and slides. They unearthed bones, tiny, brittle bones. The project was halted, the site was quarantined, and the nightmares began anew. The children were the first to see them. Shadowy figures on the edges of playgrounds, voices whispering from the trees, invisible hands yanking them off their bikes, pushing them downstairs. Parents blamed bullies, doctors prescribed pills, but the children knew the truth. The dead had never left, and they were angry. In a crumbling flat across town, Detective Havers lay dying. Cancer had eaten away his body. His mind was already half gone, ravaged by guilt, by ghosts. As the morphine dulled his pain, he dreamed of Cromwell Street, of the mist, of the small hands reaching for him. And then, on the night he died, he woke. Standing at the foot of his bed was a little girl, Heather, her face whole again, her eyes wide and sorrowful. She reached out her hand. He took it without hesitation, and together they vanished into the mist. Elsewhere, Rosemary West withered away in a maximum security prison. Her mind broke completely in the final years. She spoke only in riddles, nursery rhymes twisted into horrific parodies. On the night of her death, the guards heard something, not screaming this time, singing. Hundreds of voices rising from the very walls. Children's voices. They found her body twisted into an impossible shape, every bone broken, her mouth frozen open in a silent scream. No one could explain it. No one tried. The prison block where she died was sealed off forever. After Rosemary's death, the hauntings at Cromwell Street intensified. Locals reported blackouts, sudden storms, animals vanishing into thin air. The mist returned permanently, clinging to the empty lot like a living thing. No matter what the town tried, they couldn't reclaim the land. It belonged to something else now, something ancient, something furious. The council abandoned the lot. Fences were erected, warning signs posted. Danger, unstable ground, the signs read. But it wasn't the ground that was dangerous. It was what slept beneath it, waiting, growing stronger. At night, you can still hear them. The laughter, the crying, the singing. If you walk too close, you might feel a hand slip into yours, cold, small, insistent. And if you're foolish enough to follow, you'll never come back. In the end, Cromwell Street faded from the maps. GPS systems refused to register it. Delivery drivers avoided it. No new buildings rose on the cursed ground. It became a black hole in the middle of Gloucester, an open wound no one could close, a place where the sins of the past still screamed into the darkness, demanding to be heard. Some say that Fred and Rosemary West weren't the cause, that they were merely symptoms, that Cromwell Street itself was a blight and ancient evil that chose them, that fed on their depravity, that made monsters of ordinary people. And when the Wests were gone, the house simply waited for new blood, new pain, new monsters. Because evil doesn't die, it evolves, it spreads. And somewhere, right now, in some quiet, forgotten street, it's waking up again.